Thank you very much, Armine, for that expansive research. Took 3 years, I believe, right, to conduct with a team of amazing. Thank you very much. Next speaker, we want to invite Dr. Levon Abrahamyan, who, as many of needs no introduction. But let me just say, for those of us who are new to Armenia, Levin Abrahamyan was already one of the foremost ethnographers in the Soviet period, was from the Republic of Armenia, and is now the corresponding member of the National Academy of Science of the Republic of Armenia, head of the Department of Contemporary Anthropology Studies, the Institute of Archeology and Ethnography at the National Academy of Sciences. Please.
I would like to thank Armine for such deep and extensive and very informative analysis. Of course, her colleagues too. And I'm afraid that she said that I will present something something that will cover some part of the ecological movement in Armenia. I'm afraid I will not be able to do this. I will just want to, at least in this format, I would like only to make some notes to what Armine told us. Well, perhaps everybody knows that during the Soviet regime, only a few political activities were allowed. And the ecological movement was one of these activities. The authorities evidently did not see them as posing any great danger to their regime. That is the reason why, in many cases, the democratic and more frequently nationalistic movements began as or took the shape of ecological movements. The ecological movement not only disguised the banned nationalist manifestations, but also concealed prohibited interethnic violence. And this is just the point which interests me now. In Estonia, for example, the ecological movement fought against the phosphorus mines. Here we also have mines in the late Soviet period, about which so interestingly presented Armenia here. These phosphorus mines that were polluting and damaging Estonian land. Actually, it was a revolt against the Soviet center, which was responsible for the mining. But as a consequence, it was also a fight against the Russian-speaking population of Estonia, and especially against the ethnic Russians, who were mainly involved in the mines and whose number was increasing parallel with the expansion of mining. It is difficult to say now whether it was disguised national violence from the beginning or whether the anti-Russian violence was a byproduct, a natural development of the ecological movement. In any case, the ecological movement became a kind of allowed anti-Russian aggressive movement in Estonia. However, one may suspect that this was not just an unexpected development, because once Estonia became independent, it began to conduct an openly nationalist policy, particularly against its Russian population. While Estonia provides one of the clearest illustrations of how the ecology and national violence might be linked. The Georgian case is much less explicit. The ecological movement in Georgia was mainly fighting against a project also initiated by Moscow of building a tunnel through the Caucasian mountains which would shorten travel between the Transcaucasus and Russia. The trains, were forced to go around the mountain range from the left or from the right along the coasts. The ecological movement was active in the mid-80s and was not linked directly with the national movement of the late 80s. Judging from its materials and activities, and I spoke with many activists of this movement and also spoke with those who opposed this movement. It was a purely ecological movement pursuing no political aims. However, there was in existence an anti-Georgian and Ossetian view which claimed that the Georgians were disguising under the fight against the tunnel project their unwillingness to create easy communication between the two parts of the Ossetian people, which were divided by the high mountain range. Thus, by resisting the project, the Georgians were fighting according to this view. I'm not saying that this is a right view, but I just wrote it down as an anthropologist, against the South Ossetians of Georgia who would like to join with North Ossetia of Russia to form a united and independent Ossetia. I was aware of this view long before South Ossetia declared its independence, and an ethnic war between Georgians and Ossets supported by the Russians began in 1991. I'm just trying to show how the ecological movements can transform into some other kind of political movements. However speculative this view might be, it nevertheless demonstrates that ecological movements can become rather flexible and convenient mechanisms for realizing disguised national violence. It is no mere chance that in 1989 the Georgians used exclusively ecological rhetoric to obstruct a plan to build a railroad through the territory of Georgia that would connect Armenia with the Black Sea ports. A little later in 1991, Georgia's authoritarian president Gamsahurdia did not need this kind of rhetoric anymore when rejecting the project. He simply said in one interview to a journalist that Georgia is not a yard with a through passage. In Azerbaijan, the large-scale nationalist mass rallies in November 1988 began as ecological meetings, protesting against the Armenians who were said to be destroying valuable tree species in order to build a potentially polluting aluminium producing factory in Topkhana, a small plateau in mountainous Karabakh. The Armenians were actually planning to build a small enterprise which would process the aluminium tin imported from Armenia. In other words, it was planned as a processing and hence potentially non-polluting enterprise. Moreover, not a single tree grows in the Topkhana plateau. It's also an interesting point. Nevertheless, in this case, pseudo-ecological rallies were needed to channel anti-Armenian aggression. This symbolic channeling soon took explicit form during the anti-Armenian pogroms in Kirovabad and several attacks on the Armenian quarters in Baku. Just close and on the background of these ecological movements. So we see that really ecological movements sometimes can play a role of catalysts of other types of movements and sometimes violent movements and inter-ethnic conflicts. As for Armenia, I would just like to to say that ecological movement began here earlier, of course, than the Karabakh movement. And we have here an authoritative and veteran of this movement, I see, Mrs. Karide Danila, who perhaps will agree with this point and will not agree with the other point I'm going to say now. Many times I heard this from very many informants, and even Paul Goebel, a prominent American scholar, writes this, that the Karabakh movement was the transformation of ecological movement in Armenia, that everything began as ecological movement and then transformed here, not to the violent movement against somebody else, as I presented in the couple of these examples, but to the national movement, national liberation movement, or however it will be called, the Karabakh movement as we know it. Actually, this was not the case, and it's also an interesting thing, and this gives, you see that the picture of a wider spectrum of ecological movements in general. In Armenia, already in 1986, there was a big ecological movement in the future Freedom Square, and where the prominent poets, Silva Kaputikian, Maru Markaran, I remember Zorik Balayan and others, they were speaking only ecological issues. There, this shows that I can't say it, you see, just that this is the only truth, but I think that it was a very loud meeting from above. It was not an ecological movement from below. In any case, it was allowed to say something, and many things were said which were not a good thing for the government at that time, that the Armenian nuclear plant should be closed, and that the phosphorite, nyrite, the enterprise also should be closed. So something, not a very good thing for the government, but at least they thought that the ecological rally would not be very, very dangerous for this stage of the Soviet freedom, let's say in this way. But interestingly, that during this meeting, there was an announcement that the next day will take place another meeting near today's residence of the president, or close to it. That presently there was this garden of lovers, just in this Pushkin Square, which now became this popular place for in Bagram Avenue. People gathered because there was an announcement at the Ecological Movement that a Karabakh, something related with Karabakh, would take place the next day, which didn't take place actually, because it only began, and police, militia at that time didn't allow it to develop. But why I'm saying this? Because in 1988 also some ecological march took place from Abujan city and town, and some ecological issues also about the clean air and other things were raised, and just at that time was announced that the next day another meeting on Karabakh, quite another type of meeting, will take place. That's that the ecological movement, as a matter of fact, played the role of herald of the next activities. Not that it was that just flowed into another activities. Am I right? With this guy? But because now there was, I heard sometimes some opinions that it was just the same thing which goes and brought to another type of rallies and political activities and civil rights activities. And but it's very important that ecological movement from the first days was going parallel to this to the political rallies, and if you had some hunger strikes, not counting the first hunger strike during the summer of 1988, there should be at least one hunger striker who would protest for ecological issues. So it was going always parallel. And when the members of the Karabakh committee were arrested, parallelly was arrested also a representative of the ecological movement, Hachik Stambultsan. So it shows that it's going always parallel. It's a prominent thing, I think, and this shows what role the ecological movement plays in general political activities. And when we come to today's activities, which Armine so brightly represented, it's also very interesting, and I'll just show you only symbolically a couple of hints of those time. A gas mask, which was a pop art, something like pop art protest in 1988 in the Freedom Square, or a poster like the one, not this one, but the other one. It's in Russian, is RS, which is the Armenian the nuclear plant, and you see from the symbolism that why it should be closed. And children, even these teenagers, protesting against the atomic plate, this nuclear plate. By the way, there was an opinion that it was the ecological movement that closed this atomic plant. Actually, this is not the cause. The protests were, of course, beginning, as I told you, from 1987, but this kind of enterprises are not closed just by movements during Soviet times, let me say this. But there was an opinion, and when that was time when the difficult economic, energetic crisis came, many informants were blaming ecologists that they did this. But at the same time, some other enterprises were closed, and closed sometimes not very cleverly. Now Armine showed us about copper producing enterprises in Alaverdi, which were very polluting in Soviet times. And instead of just closing them or just trying to reform them, which was very possible, and there were different projects, as far as I know, of reforming them, of reconstructing them. They were destroyed. They were just destroyed in the most fierce way, and which is not the best thing that I think our ecological movement of the 80s could be very proud of. When today's movement, ecological movement, began, and Armine showed this very interestingly. What I would like to say, they are beginning as a typical civil society, using not the movements, but just from the first springs of, I don't know, the sprouts of of civil society in Armenia. And again, it's not, I would not like to say here that it was ecological movement that created all the other the movements in Armenia, present movements in Armenia, especially the movements of civil society. Now we have the famous Mashtod Square, and here we have not just ecologists beginning, but this tiny girl, Kahane Melkonyan, as far as I know, with a poster, who was standing alone, as far as I know, and who was protesting against these boutiques that were going to be built in the square, although there is some hint about ecology with this Kanach Goti, that is, you have already a hint of the beginning of the ecological protest, although as far as I know she was representing we are the masters of this city, and not just ecologists. But what is very characteristic for today's civil society movement is that, and activities, is that just learning from this protest action of this tiny girl, all the groups about which Armine mentioned in Tervut, in Tochka, and other places, joined her, joined her in this protest. Again with this, because there is a Kanach Goti also here, but not just because it is Kanach Goti, but because they are bearing this civic activism in their spirit, and so they joined this girl, and nearly 2 weeks after, I am following my colleague Hamlet Petrosan, who studies this movement. Excuse me, of course, Hamlet Melkonyan, who is sitting here, and after 2 weeks, the main rhetoric of the Mashtod Square was ecological. So active were ecologists who joined the movement, and after this, it began mainly civic society rhetoric. This shows that I think these tiny details, small details, show how ecological movement is involved in any social movement, and you can find them also in different city activisms of today, and everywhere where you have some civic society movement, you can find ecologists. But they are going sometimes as the first persons, which is a normal thing for the civil society. As Armine said, that this is not cited. This is not something that is as Karabakh movement. You have that is mass movement. That there might be very many movements and very specialized movements. And our ecological movement, I'm proud to say, that now became a real professional civic society movement, which is just eager to help any other movement. And this is the hope, and my hope is that the civic society in Armenia is really becoming a reality. This is actually some notes that I wanted to say, and not just give a great analysis of that that I'm afraid you were thinking I will give you. Thank you.
Before he got on the stage, I asked Levin Abrahamyan if he wants to speak in English or Armenian. He paused and said, "It doesn't matter. I speak both very badly." So, and of course, he proved himself at least wrong on that front.